another meeting of the Faculty Mentoring Faculty Program. My name is Andy Jones, and I run this program for the Teaching Resources Center. We hold these meetings beginning in the second week of the quarter every Friday, this quarter at 12:30 here in this room. One reason that we've chosen this room is that it makes for easy filming of our featured presenters. And I'd like to remind you that all of these presentations can be seen at fmfp.ucdavis.edu. The Faculty Mentoring Faculty Program is about 3 years old, and we hold these, and we've done this every quarter and filmed about the last 7 quarters worth. So there are a great variety of talks and presentations that I hope that you will check out. It's well worth your time. Often we start these with introductions, but I think this week we will get right to our presentation by Keith Watenpaugh and leave some time afterwards for discussion and then additional opportunities for you to chat amongst yourselves. I expected a good turnout when I heard what Keith's title was going to be, because whereas when the Teaching Resources Center offers talks and presentations with uplifting and life-affirming and optimistic titles, then people feel like, you know, either they have to go or they should go, but really often they don't go. But if we mention genocide, if we mention fundamentalism, then people will come because these sort of topics touch upon us not only in terms of our obligations as teachers, but because of our concerns about the world, and especially about the changing nature of our student body, and thinking about how is it that we're going to be receptive to the great variety of students in our classes. Keith speaks to some of these topics and to a great number of others. We had a pre-talk lunch on Wednesday where I don't even know if we touched on most of the topics that come up in his title, but we did touch on what makes innovative teaching, what makes traditional teaching, what makes responsible teaching. And I think that our featured guest today, Keith Watenpaugh, professor from Religious Studies, will touch on all these topics and more. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Keith Watenpaugh.
Thank you,
Keith.
Andy. I'm Keith David Watenpaugh. Andy assured me this was very informal. Now I see there's a television and I'm mic'd up. And okay. So I told me, Andy, I would have worn a tie. So I'm also, I thought I'd talk some about my own style of teaching too. And I'm generally a podiumist, but if that's a word or not, I'm not sure. So, and I do really want to thank Andy for this chance, because to me, it's important to sometimes step back every once in a while and reflect on what we do as teachers and as people who teach, and what we teach and why we do it. Sometimes we take that for granted. We get into ruts. We just keep moving along. And it's nice to every once in a while just take that little step back and just sort of think about why we're doing it. So over the last few days, since Andy popped this on me, I've had that chance to think about these topics. And just a bit about me. I went to UCLA. I did my graduate work there. I spent much of the 1990s living abroad in Syria and in Turkey, and I did undergraduate work in Egypt. Since the 2000s, I've spent time in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon again. So I'm very much a Middle East studies specialist who found himself in a really great place at Davis, where he wasn't required to teach the Middle East survey again, and could in fact develop a whole bunch of new classes. And I developed a course called Modern Islam, which is 19th and 20th century Islamic intellectual history. I developed an undergraduate course called Fundamentalism, which I may or may not have time to talk about today. And then I began to develop a whole other wing of my teaching in an area that I call the study of human rights. And some of you may have gotten an email from me asking you to tell me what human rights courses you have in your, is that true? Did anyone get that email from me? Allison did, okay. And right now we're assembling courses for the interdisciplinary minor in human rights. So I've been trying to develop this other side of my teaching. And this is in response to personal experiences I've had as someone interested primarily in the Middle East since September 11th, but also my personal experiences with Iraq since the war. And my conclusion that this is something I understand and know about and has to be brought into our curriculum. But first, let me just talk about being a teacher and some of the things I do as a teacher. I have a long family background in teaching. I'm the 6th generation college or high school teacher in my family. So back, we were impoverished Puritans and German immigrants. We've never made any money, but we've always been teachers. And that's important because the family values it as an occupation. So it's not seen as oh, he's a teacher. It's not seen as a failure in my family. It's seen as something that's very important and very valued. Both my grandmothers had master's degrees in their own fields and were teachers. In fact, my paternal grandmother did experiments on dogs at Davis way back in the 1930s, stuff you would never do anymore. And she's deceased, so I can say this about her. So, but she did her work both at Berkeley and UC Davis they wouldn't allow her into chemistry, of course, in those days, being a woman. So what did she do it in? Any guess? Food science. That was what they allowed women to do stuff in, home economics and food science. And teaching has always, therefore, come very easy to me, but I've also had a lot of opportunities to teach throughout my young adulthood and then into my career. One thing that some of you, none of you, in fact, Allison, you don't even know this about me. My first job after college was as a national park ranger, which was a great job. And it was a very special job because I worked as a national park ranger at Fort Clatsop National Historical Monument in Oregon, where every day I got up and I dressed up in buckskins and pretended I was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was great. It was probably the best job. Well, no, this is the best job I ever had. It was almost the best job I ever had. And it was hands-on interaction with hundreds and hundreds of people every day. And we were costumed interpreters, we weren't impersonators, so we were still, 20th century human beings, but dressed up in buckskins and pretty stuff with long rifles. And on the one hand, it was a fun experience for me, but it also was like a boot camp for teaching for me, because it was interacting with people in an educational setting 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, one-on-one, small groups, big groups, over and over again. And I think that something that's very important and maybe lost on many junior teachers is that it takes a lot of practice to be a good teacher. And the best practice, the best preparation for being a good teacher is teaching itself over and over again, and also sort of stretching it. I was trained my undergraduate training was in 20th century Middle East, and I was all of a sudden interpreting Lewis and Clark. So it was a real stretch for me, right? And I learned very important life skills, including how to start fires without matches and how to tan the hides of deer. So I'm prepared if anything bad happens. And as I began my professional career, I taught first at some very small places. I taught at Williams College, and then I taught at Lemoyne College, which were small liberal arts colleges on the East Coast, where I taught a lot. At Lemoyne, I was doing the 3-3 load, 2 preps, but a 3-3 load, hardcore teaching, often in areas that were not my own area of expertise. And that was important because it gave me a great deal of confidence that you can teach outside of your area of training. Maybe you can't do it very well, but you can certainly do it in an effective manner. And that there were techniques and tools you could use to in fact, prepare yourself for teaching outside of it. And I found, this is the thing, teaching things that I didn't know a lot about was actually kind of fun and easier. It was, we can explore why it's easier in a later point of the talk today. But I developed some sort of style and substance ideas about teaching. The first is, of course, you as a teacher, you set the tone in your classroom. It's your room. For those minutes that you're there, that's your room. And when I teach my big class, my big 120-person class, which for some of you may not be a big class, but for those of us in the humanities is a humongous class, I wear a tie. I put on the tie, and I put on the coat, and I put on the slacks, and I show up dressed that way. And I don't do it because I like wearing a tie, because that is not the case. I do it for the same reason that doctors wear white lab coats. right? I mean, why do they wear white lab coats? I mean, are they going to spill something on them when they're visiting with you? Right, they wear the white lab coat to tell you that they're a doctor, right? And that you should trust them. So we wear the tie. Now, I'm married to another academic, and she is very keenly aware of this too, and I see her spend a great deal of time preparing for teaching. She dresses very nicely and so on. And I was thinking about this too. I have the added advantage that a lot of other kinds of professionals don't necessarily have. I kind of look like a college professor just to start with. I hope this is not offending anyone. And the more gray I get in my beard, the more I look like one. I mean, I'll put the leather patches on my coat. You know, so it's been fairly easy for me. But I do think that slight anachronistic behavior, if you will, of wearing the tie and sort of showing up that way, signals that this is a different place and a different moment for the students themselves. I usually use a folder to bring my stuff in. Just kind of a neat, and you can shove stuff in it and it doesn't appear to be messy. So you have your nice little folder. And then I also have what I call the draconian rules for classroom behavior. Well, that's what my TAs call it. I just call them the rules. And this is something that I learned from my other grandmother, who was a high school math teacher for 100 years, I think, in rural school systems. And she said, you know, just set out some pretty tough rules at the beginning of class and be very honest about it and why you're doing it. And it seems to work. So I have 3 rules that I established at the beginning of the quarter, and I put it about the only time I ever use a PowerPoint is in fact to project the rules on the screen. The first one is don't be late, and if I've closed the door during lecture, you're not to come in, period. And I don't start exactly at the hour. I sort of chit-chat for a bit. The second is if your phone goes off or whatever, then I want you to leave the room. And the third one is you have to be prepared from the moment I start talking to have a question asked of you. You know, these are kind of scary rules, right? But you know, that historically this would have been the case, that these were the expectations. And I explain to students why I do it, and especially do it when I teach in those big rooms downstairs. Have you ever taught in these rooms? Right? Have you ever moved your butt in the seats? They make a terrible noise. So the thing is that what I'm trying to do is create a situation where there's no external distractions. And it's also sort of a larger thought of mine that creating the classroom environment itself should be different from the kind of environment that our students operate in now, which is so full of all sorts of distractions. That it's so hard for our students now to ever find a place free of distractions where they can concentrate. And what I'm trying to accomplish in the classroom by the draconian rules is to in fact create a space in which those distractions are kept to a minimum. That it's them and it's me and it's the ideas and the sort of understandings that we're trying to create in that room at the same time. Okay, so once those are done, and I have not found any pushback from students. In fact, I think most of the students tend to think this is a good idea, and they become sort of, they cooperate with them in what they feel is their best interest. In terms of substantially my style of teaching, I like to think that I've adopted the Socratic method, and I never really do very well at it. And I don't know if Socrates himself was any good at it either. But nevertheless, I try to use the Socratic method. But I'm also someone who likes to tell stories when I'm lecturing, not that are connected to what I'm lecturing about. And I do that because I think that one of the very human things that we do is tell stories to each other. That we explain things through our stories, talking about our experiences and our stories, but also stories about the topic at hand. And that's something that's very human, and we can build a better connection with people through the act of storytelling itself. And I'm in a disciplinary field where it's a lot easier to do that, right? I mean, I don't know if this is possible in physics particularly, but it might be. But that basic human exchange of me explaining something, I kind of, I romanticize it a bit and sort of think maybe we'll be sitting around the campfire, sort of talking about stuff. but that's that relationship. And it's a personal relationship that's being established through that act, at least from my perspective. Okay. And that gets me to sort of another question Andy sort of posed to me, which was about the idea of teaching philosophy, right? And I know that when I remember when I was applying for jobs, they always wanted me to, write my teaching philosophy. Anyone who's applied for a job in the last 20 years, you've had to do that, right? And I thought it was a terribly artificial thing. Because teaching had come very easy to me. I enjoyed doing it. And I knew that there were all these buzzwords out there. I mean, student-centered learning and stuff like that, sometimes people wanted to see in these letters. So, I dutifully put them together. But when Andy came to me and sort of thought about this, I don't have much of a teaching philosophy. I have a philosophy about being a teacher. And I think that if one approaches being a teacher in a more holistic manner, this question of teaching philosophy is much less of an issue. And some of the ideas I have about what it means to be a teacher is wrapped up in those ideas. The first is, and this is just sort of a side note, I'm personally sort of very skeptical of a lot of sort of new pedagogy, new pedagogical techniques. Just very skeptical of them. I won't sort of reject every sort of suggestion, but I'm very skeptical, just very skeptical. But what I don't like are sort of bureaucratic barriers being placed between me and my students at all. Things that sort of reduce that relationship. The second thing is, and I don't know if any of you read my POV at DHI. No, probably not. But I talked about how I don't like it when the university is compared to a business, and that how relationships and functions of the university are made into the analogy is drawn with sort of things outside of the university are in the marketplace. And the one I really hate is the commodification of what we do and the transformation of our students into consumers. So anything that sort of smells like that, I just can't stand. I mean, I see the relationship between teachers and students as its own definitive thing. There's nothing like it. And anything that reduces that is something that we as teachers and educators need to really struggle against. That was my editorial comment for the day. So I do think when I think about being a teacher, I think about a unique position in human society with a unique role and a unique code of conduct and body of ethics. And in my own work, I want to explore with my students the human condition. I mean, that's sort of the larger import here, primarily through the discipline of history and the production of historical knowledge. And I don't want to get into a debate about whether or not historical knowledge is possible or not. But I want to lead students into that knowledge and at the same time help convey to them and help them to establish on their own appropriate analytical and empathetic tools. And part of that for me, part of that process of exploring the human condition is calling forth what I call in my historical research, my own work, unbearable pasts. Calling forth unbearable pasts. And I don't expect everyone to be able to do that. I think there are some people who can do that, who are constitutionally built to be able to look into the past, to look at unbearable things and be able to reproduce them in a not necessarily comprehensive, but at least persuasively comprehensive manner for people in the present, to understand the human condition, but also to understand what it means to be human in that moment. And that's where we get into, that's my segue into exploring my research and teaching into teaching really awful things. The first really awful thing I want to talk about teaching is genocide. Now, why do I work on genocide? The first reason is that my research in part is about genocide, and I'm writing a book right now called Bread from Stone, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, in which the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians of 1915 plays a tremendous role in understanding what humanitarianism is, understanding what I call the bureaucratization of compassion. But in other words, things like the League of Nations and aid and relief and refugees and so on. And the other reason is for many years, I lived in a community of Armenian genocide survivors, and I'm married to a descendant of Armenian genocide survivors. So this is also part of who I am as a person, that this history, this past, is something that I'm interested in, and I want my own children, who are Armenian, to also know about this. So this is just part of it. And I was worried as well that at Davis, this history wasn't being, these ideas weren't being taught, so I decided to bring it, to teach it myself. The other thing is that I'm someone who studies modernity. And to my mind, genocide is the cumulative manifestation of the direction that modernity can take, and in fact has taken. And genocide is the modern thing par excellence. And so as a topic of teaching, as a thing to teach, it brings up a whole other host of issues about the modern world, about being modern, about technology, about government, about nationalism, about hate, and about religion, that we can all roll into sort of one interesting phenomenon, genocide. Also, it, just sum it this way. It seemed important to me to teach it. It just seemed something that was important for me to teach, because I knew about it, I could take it, and I could teach it. So some of the challenges to teaching genocide. Do you want me to close the door? And no one could come in. Oh, are you leaving? Oh, man. It's okay. Sure. Where was I? See, it disturbed our learning environment. Let me just use that moment to take a drink of coffee, too. Genocide is also the most awful thing, or a most awful thing. And when you're teaching awful things, and I was sort of thinking about this, that some of the challenges of teaching discreetly awful things have to do with both emotional responses, but also trying to keep sight of the human dimension of it. So let me just outline briefly, from my perspective, two of the basic challenges of teaching genocide. The first is not to allow the sheer scale of the horror of genocide to overtake or obliterate the human dimension of it. Now, what does that mean? Genocide, slavery, these sorts of things, they are horrible because of the sheer size of it. So it's a lot of numbers. Lots and lots of numbers, 20 million, 1.5 million. Well, the numbers become kind of numbing. And in your own mind, how is this any different than understanding the score of a football game? So the numbers become sort of numbing and become anonymous. And one of your challenges as a teacher of these things is to make sure that those numbers aren't anonymous, that they correspond to actual human pain and trauma and horror and fear. And there are ways to do that. We can talk about some of the ways to do that later. But that's one of the challenges, that you don't want a discussion about something like genocide just to turn into a numbers game, or something where you allow the numbers or the size of it to make you sort of respond in a dispassionate fashion. Okay. The second is not to essentialize victims and perpetrators in genocide. And I call this the dual phenomenon of the cult of the victim and the demonology of the perpetrator. The cult of the victim and the demonology of the perpetrator, in which somehow there's something sort of metaphysically holy about the victim group, and there's something super inhuman about the perpetrator group. Whereas in both cases, it's wrong, right? The victims are people, the perpetrators are people, right? And that's something that sometimes is very hard. Students would like to create that kind of moral, absolute moral distance between themselves and the perpetrator group by somehow making them superhuman. Right? This is why Nazis make such good villains in movies, right? But that they want to create this incredible moral and ethical distance between themselves and the perpetrator group, of course, saying, we would have never done that, of course not. We would have rescued people. We would have hidden Anne Frank, right? That they want that distance, but that distance isn't available, should not be made easily available to them in this situation. And the same with the sort of notion that victims are somehow essentially good, and that there's something that they didn't deserve it. I mean, these are kinds of discussions that don't make a lot of sense. Why do such horrible things happen to good people? I don't know if these are relevant questions to the discussion of genocide, but students often really want to understand this. Okay, so those are two challenges. But the observation I also would make too is that we can use most of the same tools that we use elsewhere to study other phenomena, to study awful things. I mean, there's no reason why we can't use those same tools. And so let me sort of explain that a little bit better as I sort of explore the syllabus for that class, and I can make it available to you upon request. Just send me an email. But there's two ways one could approach the study of genocide, right? One is that you can just sort of look at each genocide, right? You could start, and there's always arguments about where you start the study of genocide and where you end the study of genocide. I tend to start in the 20th century, especially, and I link it to modern warfare and colonialism. But you could just say, okay, we'll start in 1950. Well, we could start with Namibia, for example. We can go 1915 with the Armenians, and then we can do to the Holocaust, and then if you just do it serially, then you really do end up doing the mind-numbing numbers game. Instead, what's important is to try to understand the kinds of threads and themes that pass through all genocides, the things they have in common, the things they might have different, what it tells us about the modernity of genocide itself. And so what I've done in the courses, the genocide course that I developed, is I identified 5 what I call thematic lenses, or themes. I kind of like the idea of lenses because you see through them, right? So, and the color's the way you see. These are beginnings in which I discuss sort of the origins of genocide, but where I also begin to introduce the legal theory of genocide as developed by Raphael Lemkin and then established by the United Nations. I talk about styles. The second theme is styles and technologies, in which I compare how it happens, and also sort of get students to understand both the technologies of mass killing, but also technologies of mass media, especially how you create a victim, how you identify your victims bureaucratically, but then how you also construct them as a class of people who should be destroyed. Then I talk about a third lens is remembering and commemoration, in which I sort of look critically at the sort of formulation of genocide museums and Holocaust memorials, but also poetry, and some of the few times that I introduce technology directly into the classroom is that it's possible to visit museums online now, right? And so I will sometimes break some of my rules about teaching naked and bring in, do online tours of the Holocaust Museum in DC or the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan, and then also look at monuments and so on, monuments and art and poetry. And then I look at the final 2 lenses are first denial. One of the interesting phenomena of genocide is that someone always denies it happened. And that's one of the very important sort of dimensions of the responsibility of the teacher in this, is to really assure the students that you can have factual knowledge that genocides have taken place. And finally, I conclude with responsibility. And responsibility is where we explore attempts at justice and actual justice, moments of justice and punishment in genocide. And I end on responsibility for one very important reason. Because about halfway through the class, often, I think Allison's heard this story, students will come up to me and say, I'm really getting sad. This class is really tearing me apart. I'm really, really sad. And I usually say, I would be more upset if you weren't. I would be much more worried about you if this wasn't affecting you. But just so that everyone can kind of remain sane, you have to end with discussions of possible justice and prevention. Because if you don't, then you've not provided the students or even yourself with a possible way to get out of this this sadness and the awfulness of it. And of course, these are the justice is always incomplete. I mean, most perpetrators of genocide get away with it, right? But we would like to think that we are getting better at punishing it, or at least trying to prevent it. Okay. All right. The other reason why I sort of end with that is because of the kinds of students that this course tends to. How am I doing on time, Andy? Should I go another 10 minutes? Okay. The other reason why and now all of you are sad, see? I should make you guys cheer up. The reason why I also sort of think about the kinds of students who take this class. And this class tends to fill up within minutes of it appearing on SysWeb. So it doesn't have any problems with that. I've never understood why so many students want to take it. One kid said, I'm going to take it. It's a real downer, that genocide. But they come with what I call aspirational idealism, or sort of a kind of idealism or a desire to be on the right side of history, but they can't explain it. They know that they want to be on the right side of it, but they can't explain why. And I think one of the important things is, we've been thinking a lot about this as we develop our human rights curricula, is that we don't want to disabuse them of their aspirational idealism entirely. We'd like to shape it into something a little bit more useful to us and to them. So it's not just sort of this free-floating do-gooderism, but actually some kind of useful tools to sort of enact good, which requires a critical understanding of how good happens. Okay. So, but some of the students too have done work on the Holocaust. I think they're sort of interested in that direction. Some of them are Armenian American students who want to take it too because they want to understand that. So there's an interesting mix that usually takes place. Okay. So then I'll move to my discussion of my Iraq class, which I've taught since 2005. And explain why I chose to teach it, and talk a bit about some of the students it attracts too, and also what it means to teach about an awful thing as the awful things are happening. I have a deep personal connection to Iraq. My dad grew up in Baghdad in the 1950s, so it was sort of like I'm different from most sort of Northern European American types who, Iraq was something I knew about my entire life. And we had little trinkets from Baghdad. My dad was an amateur photographer who liked to go out and take pictures. I mean, he was a teenager. He was like 14, 15 years old, living in 1950s Baghdad. I mean, it was great. He had a great time. And I grew up with those images and a very positive view of Iraq and the Middle East. I was very different from a lot of my friends in that their first introduction was 1979 and the Iranian hostage crisis, which was a much different view of the Middle East and Muslims and Iranians and Arabs and so on. And I had wanted to do my doctoral research on Iraq, but this would have been in the 1990s during the time of sanctions. You couldn't get a Fulbright to Baghdad. It just wasn't happening. So I worked on Syria, which was right next door. In 2003, I led a team of American and European and Arab historians to Baghdad to conduct a preliminary survey of the libraries, the museums, and the research centers in the wake of the American occupation. So I was there in June of 2003, July 2003. And it stuck with me. I mean, that's the kind of experience you have that, it's something that you really don't forget. And in the month I was there, I sort of felt like I lived a lifetime in many ways. And I came back really committed to the idea that that Iraq's present was part of our present, and that we needed to help our students understand that and ourselves understand that. And also I became very involved with trying to assist Iraqi refugee scholars, and that project sort of goes in ebbs and flows. Okay. So I had a deep personal connection, and I also had this connection through the Opening Doors report, which was this report about the libraries and archives. And what I also wanted to, and sort of in the theme of awful things, I also wanted people to understand that much of Iraq isn't an awful thing. That, The war is awful. There was an awful time during the sanctions and so on. Saddam was not the world's most congenial dictator. But there was a lot about Iraq that isn't and wasn't awful. And that needed to be remembered too. But let me just talk briefly about some of the students it attracted, because this is kind of an interesting class and the kinds of students it would attract, as you might imagine. I had sort of our standard sort of religious studies and history students were taking it because they were attracted to me as a historian and a religious studies professor. We had a lot of Arab American students who were interested in it. We also had what I call the hip colonial, post-colonial kids. But then I also attracted transfer students, a lot of transfer students, the sort of second or third year transfer students who had brothers or sisters or moms or dads or uncles or brothers or whatever who were in the Guard or in the Army and were over there. And this was a way of trying to connect with that experience. And that's, that kind of connection is not standard for your average UC undergraduate who doesn't really know anyone who's in the Army and is not in the Army themselves. And then I also had, for example, the daughter of a very, very, very prominent anti-war activist. If I said her name, you would all recognize it, who's now very reviled, but who became an activist after she had lost her son in the war. And that was, and the student I had was the sister of the young man who had been killed. And I had NROT students, and ROTC students, and ROTC students, and all of whom deployed after my class. And I had vets, returning vets, some of whom were not doing too well, frankly. So that was a very interesting mix of students, I have to tell you. And one of the challenges I set for myself was trying to integrate all of their interesting, unique experiences into this class at the same time too, in which it wasn't just about me and my sort of sense of what was going on and my interpretation, but understanding their experiences as well. And the students who had siblings or people they knew in the war would often read emails that they were getting during that week from them, right? The RTC guys would explain, we watched one of a documentary about the Battle of Haditha, and they would explain their interpretation of why things were working and why things didn't work at Haditha. The post-colonial kids were, all about sort of anti-war protest and why that had worked and not worked and what they had done to try to prevent the war and why, they'd been frustrated in it. And the vets, of course, offered a little bit sort of interesting perspective as well, too. So now, let me just begin to conclude here. I'm not sure I'm going to teach the Iraq class again, because last time I taught it, it was pretty tough on me. I think I really sort of exhausted myself on that. The other thing is, I'm not sure if I taught it now, I don't know how many students would take it. When's the last time you thought about Iraq? I mean, Americans aren't really dying there anymore, right? So it's not important? I think, okay. No, but I'm wondering, I mean, plenty of Iraqis are dying, right? But it's not, we'll see. I didn't put it in my schedule for next year. But I don't know if I'm going to teach that class again. It was a class that existed in a certain historical moment, and that moment may not re-emerge. And also, I think it may be a situation where I was teaching it I began teaching it during the height of what I call the Iraqi Civil War, which is when there was the Americans call that the surge, but I call it the Iraqi Civil War. And it was a time when there was the most intense separation of Iraqi Sunni and Shia, primarily in Baghdad. It was a very violent, very vicious time. And I think I'd like to get a little bit more perspective on some of these things before I go back and teach it again. That's just my sort of sense. And that sort of brings to my ultimate conclusion that as a teacher, when you're teaching some really awful things, it can get to you, and it does get to you. And you have to take care of yourself, right? As a teacher, it affects me. My research on genocide has tended to affect me. And the last couple of years I've been up at night after doing research, and it's been kind of hard. So all my concluding thought is that when you're teaching some of these issues, you also need to keep a pulse on your own mental health when it comes to these things, because you can become so deeply involved and so intertwined, and that would be good that it affects you, but it can also become debilitating. All right, so thank you very much for your attention, and I certainly would entertain questions. Yeah.
There's certainly no lack of hotspots in that area. If you don't teach Iraq, do you have an idea of where you might go?
Well, I'm developing the human rights curricula, and so a lot of that we'll have to deal with. I mean, I'll play to my strengths, but a lot of that will be Islamic and Middle Eastern topics in that. So things that I experienced in the Iraq class, I'll integrate into some of these other curricular fields. So. Oh, and next year I am teaching genocide. So. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I don't read the newspaper properly. I was expecting from a religious studies professor to have some exposition of the, say, fundamentalism. What does that mean?
Well, in terms of time, I'd love to talk about fundamentalism, my fundamentalism survey, but in terms of time, I just didn't have a chance to do that. But I do teach one very large lecture class on fundamentalism, which where I compare and contrast the sort of textual literalists and the politics, primarily the politics of fundamentalism, of American evangelical Christianity, certain strains of political Islam, and Jewish fundamentalism, primarily in Israel. And that's an interesting class because we do have evangelical students on this campus. I don't know if anyone's told you. And some of whom, and that's a class where I don't teach evolution. I don't teach cosmology or geology, but I do have to address how creationists have tried to discuss, Darwinism and so on too. And sort of one of my favorite passages in that class is when we discuss sort of the intellectual gymnastics that had to emerge to explain the antiquity of the Earth, right? Because this is one of the big problems that literalists have is, if you can sort of presumably date the Earth, the Earth is not very old if you read your Bible in a certain way, and how you explain the putative antiquity and all the cumulative effect of science on this, and also sort of on the various iterations of creationism going back to the late 19th century, culminating in sort of discussions about intelligent design. So it's interesting to do that because we do have a lot of science students who indeed face these issues, and we have a lot of students who are trying to sort of, in their own mind, I think, make a compromise between science and religion. And that school, university, is where a lot of those issues really come to a head for them. So it's in the fundamentalism class, these issues are real. The subtleties of those relationships are no longer present because fundamentalism tries to make very sharp distinctions. So sure.
A concrete question.
Sure.
Today, they convicted.
The guy who shot the
That's
abortion
right.
doctor?
That's right. And he is a Christian from a Lutheran Christian denomination. And what is the difference then between what we call a terrorist who is supposed to be exercising his fundamental insights into whatever?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that.
Should we not call that person?
Yeah, I think. Well, that's a whole other discussion, and I have my own thoughts about how terrorism should be dealt with in the criminal justice system and so on, regardless of if it's, bin Laden or the guy who killed the abortion doctor, right, or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. but you know, I think one of my goals as a teacher is to try to get students to look beyond the sort of the absolute discussions of these things that have been so prominent since the past administration, that really, as part of its public discourse, really wanted to think in absolutes in terms of our enemies and us and them and so on. And you know, I haven't taught fundamentalism since Barack Obama has become president, so it'd be interesting to see if there's any change in that. It was, you know, when I first taught it, it was back during the what was the great that we live in the reality-based community. Is that? Yeah, but things had been during that sort of middle period of the Bush administration when, you know, up was down and black was white, that the students, I think, really began to engage very fiercely in some of the underlying problems of evangelicalism as it was manifest at that moment in politics and sort of the issues associated with it. So, anyone else? Go ahead.
When you talk about Iraq, did your students run into trouble with the Bush people, that you are looking up something, then they're watching you looking up things? I mean, there was a time when people were being watched, and if you search something, there was...
Well, there's some... You still had students... Our students sometimes are very reluctant to say of people in power that they lied. It's kind of hard for them sometimes to do that. They're a little bit too. I always thought it was very. Some of our students were very easy. They found that very easy to do. But I think some of the others were very reluctant to be very critical of the administration, even after it had come out that things had been fabricated and that you know that they were not so willing to be critical of the administration. Even then, even as facts were coming out that you know, people had lied and that this, you know, that the predicate case for the invasion of Iraq had been fabricated, and they still were giving the administration a lot of reasonable doubt, and it was. Tony, well, but England has pretty much concluded that the war was illegal. So, but yeah, so I call it incipient Toryism on the part of my students, right? Where they're just a little bit too enamored of those in power, and I'd sort of like them to challenge a little bit more. Like, you know, this isn't Berkeley in the '60s, I guess. I don't know. But maybe now, after the success of the protest, maybe they're kind of changing some of their ways of approaching authority. Maybe not. Maybe that's bad for us. I don't know. So, anything else? Go ahead. Yeah.
I teach acting, and this quarter I'm teaching a course I've not taught before, which is a lower division fundamentals of acting. So a lot of the students don't have huge amounts of knowledge about the subject. And so I wanted to pick a text that would resonate for them in a number of ways. And I've decided to do Frank Wedekind's Spring Awakening. For two reasons. One, the musical has become a great hit and everybody's been to see it. And secondly, since I arrived from the UK 16 months ago, I've been quite shocked at the emphasis on GPA and how they're obsessed with their results. And the play is about the epidemic of teenage suicides that happened in the turn of the 19th into the 20th century when students weren't achieving academically what they wanted to achieve. Mm-hmm. So I'm aware, I suppose my desire to address this material is I kind of want to get them to reflect on the absurdity of putting results so high on their agenda. At the same time, it's a tricky subject. I wondered if you had any perspective on how to engage with these subjects outside of your specific realm.
Well, one thing they're going through a process of questioning and challenging, right? That's one of the things I think is very important, and one thing I want to cultivate: question, challenge, question, challenge. They need to know that you're going through that same process all the time too, right? So that it's. This is one of these awful pedagogical words, modeling behavior, right? But you know, my sense is that the kinds of doubts and the kinds of your desire to understand, you make decisions, you revise them, you write a paper, you revise it, you make a hypothesis, you revise it. This process of being a humane thinker, you don't have all the answers all at once and completely in that moment. And so if they can see that you go through that process of questioning and thinking and challenging and making mistakes. Remember, that was at Williams College, one of the things they had to make the students understand is okay to make a mistake. These were very high achieving, high pressurized students, right? And making a mistake was okay. I went to public schools, we did it all the time. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm very comfortable taking moments aside in my own classes to talk about what I'm working on in terms of my own research at that moment. Saying, well, I've been investigating this archive, and I used to think this, and now I think that. Right? Or I got comments back on my article, and I have to revise it now. You're going to get comments back from me, and you're going to have to revise it too. So we're all in this together, kind of idea, and that it's not so much that there's a kind of in the teacher-student relationship, there's a series of overlaps in terms of how we approach knowledge and thinking and teaching. We're not so discrete from each other in that moment. So.
I teach global climate change, and
I'm sure they deny that.
if you take many of the very distinguished scientists studying that today, you'll find that prospects for the future are very grim. Very grim. And I have been studying myself the last several years, number of failing states, and what makes them fail, and how does climate change then lead to that, or how could it lead to that? And I'm wondering, have you looked at or seen, or are you aware of genocides which seem to have been precipitated because groups found themselves either lacking in food or necessities and
Competition for resources is at the heart of all genocide, right? Confrontation or competition over scarce resources is one of the things at the heart of genocide. It doesn't cause it necessarily, but it's part of it, right? So, for example. One of the reasons why the Armenian genocide took place is because Muslim refugees were coming out of Russia and the Balkans into the Ottoman Empire, and they needed to get rid of the Christians and put back and replace them with Muslims. I mean, that's one of the explanations for what happened. It wasn't the cause necessarily, but it was one of the conditions. Those of us who sort of think about genocide are beginning to think about the relationship of climate, water, and genocide more thoroughly, right? So that for example, the wars in Central Africa, which have genocidal components to them, these resource issues are very important there. On the other hand, when the recent report on the prevention of genocide came out, which I have a lot of problems with, but it did talk at length about resource issues and the possibility that climate change issues would be part of the triggering of genocide in the future.
I would like to find ways of talking to students that were not so negative. I would.
With climate change,
But the point is, if you look, the Department of Defense has studied this at quite some length, and in its archives, it has projections of what will happen. The Caribbean will move towards North America. Groups will, certain groups will move, let's say from Bangladesh farther east, and then we'll have a large group coming from the Muslim section of Africa and going maybe and disrupting the EU. In each of these cases, you can see the possibility.
Right.
When the students talk about them, they say, well, what possibilities do we have to limit the probabilities of this happening? In other words, if we can foresee ahead of time, what are the distinguishing characteristics that we have to look for, and how can we perhaps change it ahead of time?
Well, the answer is to encourage them to like how we solve personal problems, right? You want to break them down into smaller bits, right? And so when I teach the genocide class, I'm not saying to my students, "Oh, we will prevent all genocide in the future." You know, we can think about how genocides are triggered. We can one thing that I think a lot of them really find interesting is the bureaucratic process of vilifying victims, where you sort of create them as a victim class, and then you use media and technology to turn them into, you know, make it appropriate to go after them, and these sorts of things.
Directs the media. How does the media come to that
Well,
persuasion to begin with?
states or it's state policy or,
It's just state policy.
right. I mean, in Rwanda, you had the Rwandan state media went after the Tutsis and demonized them and turned them into subhumans, and that was effective in helping create a situation where genocide was possible. I mean, if you turn groups into subhuman, it's a lot easier to kill them. And so, I mean, the climate change issue is very, I mean, this is something, I don't understand it as well as I'd like to, frankly, but I do understand this idea that that climate change will cause massive flows of humanity, right? And so anytime that happens, with massive flows of humanities, usually of people who are poor and darker skinned to places where people are rich and lighter skinned, that's where problems can happen, right? So, but it's interesting. I mean, yeah, you don't want to create, right? You really right, but you don't want to create a situation of utter hopelessness, because that's irrational. It's not utterly hopeless, right? So.
But not all these things are genocides. I mean, a regular war also can serve the same purpose. We did not call it, did we call World War II a genocide? Except for the...
Genocide happened during World War II.
Yeah.
Well, we have a resource that other people are hoping to take from us, and that's this room, as you can tell from this door opening and closing. Let's thank once more Keith Watenpaugh. Thank you, Keith. Next week, Ryan Galt from Agricultural Sustainability will be here to give us a talk on some of his research, especially into evaluation of students and assessment issues. So I hope that you all will return for that on February 5th, next Friday. Have a good weekend.
You too.